Hello, welcome to China Tonight. I'm Stan Grant. On the program, China again under pressure as NATO and the G7 convene. Can the government do anything to stop the booming property market? And we look at what it's like to be a reporter in China. First tonight, what's making news on the platforms people use, Weibo and WeChat, where more than 1.5 billion people communicate every month. Joining me is Yvonne Yong, and Yvonne, an unusually loud and determined protests in parts of China over proposed university mergers making waves this week.
It is rare to see youths in China protesting quite like this, Stan. The students from the eastern Jiangsu province have been complaining on social media about a proposal to merge independent colleges with vocational institutes, which they say will devalue their degrees. But the comments spilled into real life at this campus in Nanjing. The college dean was also held captive for some hours after he tried to talk to the students. Unusually, in response to the vocal complaints, the Global Times reports several colleges will suspend their plans while they reconsider. But it was the annual Dragon Boat Festival that has had Chinese people around the world talking this week. The event on the 5th day of the 5th month of the lunar calendar is a celebration of the poet and politician Qu Yuan. It's also intended as a way to ward off illness and natural disasters, so a pandemic provides an enthusiastic crowd. Zhongzi, sticky rice parcels wrapped in bamboo leaves, are a big feature of the weekend, and personally one of my favourite foods in the Chinese cuisine, Stan.
Me too. In fact, I used to love the whole Dragon Boat Festival. When we lived in Hong Kong, our kids got to be part of it each year as well. Very, very special.
China's mission to the EU has accused NATO of clinging to a Cold War mentality after the group for the first time declared Beijing poses a security threat. NATO leaders, including US President Joe Biden, met in Brussels overnight. The declaration is a change of focus for an alliance originally created to defend Europe from the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
China's growing influence and international policies present challenges to alliance security. Leaders agreed that we need to address such challenges together as an alliance, and that we need to engage with China to defend our security interests.
Well, China's state-run tabloid, the Global Times, published an editorial in response saying the communiqué was unprecedented and warned EU leaders not to be manipulated by Washington. NATO's announcement comes after China was also the focus of a G7 meeting in the UK over the weekend. The group of seven sought to find a unified position on China, and while there was broad agreement that the group needed to challenge Beijing, EU leaders also urged cooperation.
Donc, je vais être très clair, le G7 n'est pas un club hostile à la Chine. C'est un ensemble de démocraties qui entend travailler avec la Chine sur tous les sujets mondiaux sur lesquels la Chine est prête à travailler avec nous.
The leaders also unveiled a new infrastructure project for lower-income countries in a bid to rival China's multi-trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative. A statement from the White House said the move was not just about taking on China, but about providing a positive alternative vision for the world. Also on the agenda was talk about the pandemic's origins, with leaders agreeing further investigation was needed to determine how the virus emerged in China. Speculation that COVID-19 leaked from a lab in Wuhan has angered Beijing in recent months. And this week, leading Chinese virologist Xu Zhengli hit back, telling the New York Times she doesn't know how her work in Wuhan has come to be targeted, and that there's no evidence the virus came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In response to increasing international pressure over trade, technology and human rights issues, China has a new tool. Fed up with US and EU sanctions on Chinese officials and firms, Beijing now has an anti-sanctions law. It means that those involved in implementing such sanctions could find themselves on a blacklist and denied visas to China. They could be expelled from the country, banned from doing business there, or have their assets seized or frozen.
我们也认为国家有必要制定一部专门的反外国制裁法，为中国依法反制外国歧视性的措施提供有力的法治保障和支撑。
So how is this different from the past? Well, if you take the example of the 28 officials from the Trump administration who were sanctioned in January, back then there were no specific law to address the issue. Well, now there is, and analysts say the new law makes Beijing's sanctions appear less random, with specific consequences outlined, Stan.
So, Yvonne, will foreign companies be deterred from investing in China?
As you would expect, the government's thought about this. Experts say Beijing's calculated that it's a price worth paying to protect the country's interests. And meanwhile, there are others who say this latest move by China, though, is a largely symbolic one.
Yes, Yvonne, and I'll be looking into this with expert on business and human rights, Surya Dave, later in the show. Housing prices are not just a problem here in Australia. The Chinese market has also been in a growth bubble for years. In fact, in 2017, China's President Xi Jinping declared homes are for people to live in, not for speculation. Well, despite government policies to cool the market, the average price of a new home has been increasing every month this year. Annie Louie takes a look.
Hey, ABC! Welcome to my crib. Come on through. So this is the dining area. I'm going to be honest with you, I've never actually eaten at this table because it's unsanitary. Ideally, I wouldn't have to live like this. Or with these people.
Like many millennials in Australia, I haven't got nearly enough cash to buy my own place. In fact, a global study found young Aussies are below average when it comes to owning a home. But in China, it's a very different story. A huge 70% of millennials aged 19 to 36 own their own home. It's one of the highest rates of home ownership for young people in the world. Music is in the 70%. She's a school teacher who bought an apartment in her hometown of Zhuhai back in 2019. It cost about 200,000 Australian dollars.
Like my budget was a million RMB, a million yuan. So I chose from those properties that is around this range. And then I chose the one with better locations, even though the one I bought is small.
Traditionally, men are expected to provide a house when they get married in China, but you haven't waited for that. Are things changing now?
A lot of girls or boys at my age are already married. So for those married couples, they tend to buy an apartment. But for single persons like me, I think half. Like half of us will buy apartments for investment, but half will just choose to spend money on other things or save it for the future.
Property in China is tied up to traditions around marriage. Parents often chip in or pay for a house entirely to increase their son's marriage prospects. A worthy investment since parents are very likely going to move in with their son when they retire. But couples in China have had a huge advantage when it comes to buying property, because two sets of parents to juice money out of is way better than one. The CCP, alarmed by the increasingly heating property market, started to make it really hard for couples to buy multiple properties.
They wanted to cap the number of properties a family could own and pose restrictions on loans. These are to cool down the overheated housing market and to prioritize first-time buyers.
And when couples around China realised their dreams of a property empire were over, they all got divorced. Well, only temporarily.
A number of couples, they faked their divorces in order to purchase more properties with a cheaper rate as first-time buyers.
And once they bought their new properties, they'd simply get remarried. And the problem isn't limited to big cities. Last year, police in the Xinjiang province arrested 11 members of an extended family who married and divorced each other 23 times in 2 weeks to cash in on an urban renewal project.
Meanwhile, in Australia, I can't find a single person who will marry me even once. Hey you, would you marry me?
Crack off.
Fair enough.
Other popular ways to cheat the system include paying a friend or relative to put property in their name, obtaining a different ID in a maiden name,
Or just getting a completely fake ID.
The loopholes, however, are likely to continue as the government engages in a giant game of whack-a-mole with its citizens, who come up with endlessly creative workarounds. Speaking of workarounds, I reckon I've got an idea.
All right, everyone, it's now or never. Let's pool our money and buy a house. What have we got? All right, luckily I got paid last night, so here's my contribution.
One free drink, Annie. You're not going to buy... I'll be getting paid now with something more than one free drink.
Oh, are you getting paid for this, Stan?
No, do it for love, Annie. Do it absolutely for the love. Hey, listen, that divorce loophole was fascinating, but the Chinese government's recently changing the laws around this in the cooling off period. What impact is that having?
Yeah, it's having a huge impact already. Compared to this time last year, there's been a 70% drop in people getting divorced in China. So there were over 1 million divorces for the first quarter, but now it's dropped to just under 300,000. And there's a variety of reasons for that. There are people saying it's also because of the falling birth rate. So to incentivise people to stay together a bit longer and wait it out, they have to cool off for a bit. But there's a lot of different reasons that all combine. It's hard to tell when it comes to the CCP in terms of separating out all of these potential reasons.
Well, just be interested to see what the impact it has on the property market. Thanks, Annie.
No worries. Thanks, Dan.
Love it or hate it, most Australians take the presence of a free press for granted. But what changes when your government is in charge of what's written and monitors everything said? Jinghua Chan, who's worked both here and in China as a journalist, has this story.
Let's be honest, when you think about journalism in China, you probably imagine a dystopian nightmare. Censorship, propaganda, and surveillance. After all, China often pops up on lists of the world's most censored countries.
China is no longer simply an economic rival, it's becoming a dangerous enemy.
In China, many people have a similarly dim view of Western media as racist, fear-mongering clickbait produced by fly-in correspondents who can't even speak Chinese. And look, there's a grain of truth to that too. So if you live in China, what does the media actually look like? First, there's state-owned media, which includes the official government news agency, as well as lots of smaller outlets. Then there's commercial media. They operate as businesses, but they still need a license from the government to publish and broadcast. A growing sector is content creators, also known as zimeti or we media. Most content creators don't have official press cards, so they're at greater risk of being shut down or even arrested. Finally, there's foreign media, which has more freedom to publish but relies on the Chinese government's approval for visas. Even within these broad categories, there are shades and nuances.
Most people think that state media in China only sings praises for the government and that's all that they do. There are many varied and more commercialised branches of state media and they actually do very good reporting.
Amelia is a Chinese reporter who's worked across all three sectors as well as for a major foreign news outlet. To protect her identity, we've given her a false name, and this is a reenactment of our interview.
In both foreign and Chinese media, there are stories that are important but that you can't report. When you work in foreign media, sometimes a story is too small or it's not of interest for a foreign audience, so we have to drop it. In Chinese media, there's censorship. You can't write certain stories because there's a gag order, or you have to do it really quickly, otherwise you can't publish anything at all.
Is there any personal risk to you being a reporter in China?
Because there is no clear line of what you can report on, you have to guess. You have more security working for state media and commercial media. What you write might disappear, but you won't get in trouble. For authorised media, you have a reporter's licence, which gives you legitimacy. We media don't have licences. For we media, the risk is higher because you're violating law. It's just a ticking time bomb.
When I worked in China at a state-owned digital media outlet, I was often surprised at what we got away with, especially when it came to gender and GLBTIQ rights. It's usually still possible to produce robust critical coverage on social issues. There's much less leeway when it comes to geopolitics. Think Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong. That you can anticipate. But censors have also come down on dyed hair, tattoos,
you naughty piggy,
Peppa Pig,
thank you,
and even the Oscars. Sometimes it's not even an ideological issue. Any hot topic can be sensitive simply because it's trending. For the sake of social harmony, the authorities would prefer that we never get too excited about anything. Years of media control have produced a culture of self-censorship. People are often fearful of speaking to the press at all. Both foreign and local media in China struggle with access to information, interviewees and sites.
Plainclothes policemen are moving the journalists away from the front of the court.
But the ultimate threat is of police intimidation, expulsion and detention. For the last 2 years, China was reported to be the world's leading jailer of journalists. Chinese citizens do push back on censorship, like when people used Star Wars GIFs and cartoons to evade detection when sharing a deleted article about the mishandling of COVID. But soon, the censorship machine catches up. Creative and critical people find new platforms and tactics, and the cat and mouse game begins again. What's really frightening about censorship is that when it's successful, we don't even know about it. We can only see through the cracks and hope that something growing inside is getting ready to break out.
Jinghua, welcome to the program. I have some experience of what it was like to be a foreign journalist in China, just having a look at some of those images that remind me of that period then. It's not what we're used to here when it comes to the media. I know what it's like as a foreign journalist. What about being Chinese and working in the media there? And I think one of the interesting things you point out is there are ways of sort of working in it and around it too, aren't there?
Yeah, for sure. I think people are really clever about loopholes, and whenever there's a new technology, for instance, like when Clubhouse became really big this year, people just, leap on it and do whatever they can, and then that gets shut down as well. And so it is really that cat and mouse game all the time.
Tell me a story that was difficult for you or impossible for you to tell working there.
There's a lot of stories that we actually were able to do, but things also got taken offline. So, for instance, we did a lot of stories on Me Too and on, sexual abuse allegations. Shut down? Sometimes they would get published and it would be fine, and then sometimes, 2 weeks later, you'd have almost exactly the same circumstances, but a different individual in a different institution, and it would get shut down. So it was really unpredictable. It was just impossible to guess when something would be sensitive. And we've seen a real shift, haven't we, under Xi Jinping, and now no Australian journalists based there working for Australian organisations, and Cheng Lei, Australian journalist working there, was working for state media, is now also being held on charges. What does that indicate about how things have changed and where they may be going? I think her story is scary to me, for sure. It's very concerning because, to me, a news anchor for an organisation like CGTN, where
big state media,
exactly, and everything she presented would have been vetted by layers and layers of people. So it's hard to imagine that she would have done anything in her reporting that would have been terribly sensitive. So Cheng Lei's story is, I think, quite. Makes me quite anxious, for sure, for how things are progressing. But, we don't know a lot about what she's been accused of, but it's sort of leaking state secrets. And you're thinking, well, I mean, she's someone in your position, Stan. She's, she's a public face. She's working as part of a big team. So the idea that she's been a spy secretly is, it's a pretty out there accusation.
And cut off from a family, cut off from legal representation, and so on. As you say, again, an indication of just what a shift there has been. Fantastic story, Jinghua. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Stan.
Well, transparency for journalists, but also human rights observers and foreign governments, is a major issue when it comes to the plight of the Uyghur people in northwestern China. Requests for an independent investigation into the alleged persecution of the ethnic minority have been repeatedly rebuffed by the Chinese government. The stories Uyghurs share of their experience in China have been heard around the world.
The police, the guards in the camp, they didn't treat the male prisoners as human beings. They were treated less than a dog.
China tries to paint a very different picture.
Xinjiang has been transformed into a land of life, a land of thriving vitality.
What is clear is that 12 million Uyghurs, mostly Muslim, live largely in the autonomous region of Xinjiang.
It's been well documented by UN committees, Human Rights Watch and international news organisations that the push to assimilate the Uyghurs has taken on a new, and many argue sinister, intensity over recent decades. Things ramped up in 2014 following incidents the government claimed were acts of terrorism. In response, the Communist Party launched Operation Strike Hard. Crimes against humanity are alleged, including physical, mental and sexual torture, labour being used for cheap production and the destruction of the Uyghur culture. The US and Canada and the Netherlands say the behaviour constitutes genocide, and the EU and America have increased sanctions against Chinese officials. Australia does not go this far, despite calls to do more from the small but vocal Uyghur community here.
We have a slightly different approach to that turn of phrase, and I don't mean this in a pedantic or a semantic way, but both the UK and Canada have different mechanisms by which to make such a declaration.
Some people are paid to tell lies to international public.
China defends its actions, but won't allow an independent or meaningful inquiry to take place.
We do not accept an idea of an investigation on a false allegation, because that's, again, intimidation and humiliation. China has suffered such intimidation for over 170 years. It will never happen again to this day.
Well, Surya Dave is the Deputy Chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights and an Associate Law Professor at the City University of Hong Kong, and joins us now. Nice to have you with us. You just heard there what China's official line is on this, saying that it is not happening, the persecution of Uyghurs, and saying that people are paid to make up lies about China. Are you paid to make up lies about China?
I mean, Stan, we received some complaints about this particular issue sometime in 2020. And after doing our internal due diligence, we wrote to the Chinese government early this year. And so far, we have not received any formal reply from the Chinese government. As you would notice, we also wrote to several other governments and more than 150 companies. So, of course, we are independent experts appointed by the Human Rights Council. And of course, the idea of that we are getting paid to speak like this is just something I would not like to comment. This is below my dignity.
Surya, there are serious allegations here. We heard from China saying that they reject them, and they've also rejected any calls for an open inquiry into this. It does raise the question, how do you know? When we talk about potentially up to 1 million Uyghurs being held in what are being called detention camps and being brainwashed, which is some of the language that's being used here, how do you know?
I mean, of course, access to the Chinese market as such, but also in particular to Xinjiang is very difficult. But I think there have been some investigations done by journalists who are no longer in China because of those investigations. But also we have our own processes in the UN system to verify some information that we receive. And I would like to highlight that we call it allegations. So these are the allegations. And I think we would like the Chinese government to invite us to do the fact finding as part of the country visit. We visit many other countries in the world. I think China should allow our visit as well.
Others are going further than just allegations. There have been claims of genocide and coming directly from countries, including the United States, human rights groups and others. Is that how you would describe this? And when we talk about potential genocide, what are we talking about? Is this something commensurate with what we've seen in the past, or are we talking about what we saw in Nazi Germany with the Holocaust? How do we define this?
I mean, Stan, every situation is very different, but I think we have a process, and the process is that we call these complaints as allegations. They're definitely very serious in nature. That's why we are requesting the Chinese government to allow independent experts to do the fact finding.
And we know that we know that China has said no to that. So where does this leave the situation? Because it appears to me that you have two different narratives. You've outlined what the narrative of the West and human rights groups are and what the narrative of China is. China also points the finger at other countries and accuses them of hypocrisy. So you have two different systems working here, and Uyghur people potentially here caught in the middle of this. So how is this resolved? What is a way through?
I would not call it Western versus Chinese. I would say that the Chinese government has own narrative, but we're talking
which
about
is Surya, how China describes it, though, isn't it? China points
yes.
the yes,
so
exactly.
that is the Chinese perspective. I take it, but the other perspective I would say is the international human rights perspective. And Chinese government does not dismiss international human rights law, right? It is part of the Human Rights Council. And that's where I think we should take a deep political stand on this particular issue, in my view. Chinese government accepts on record, and in our meeting with them, they also mentioned it, that they don't tolerate forced labor, slavery, or anything like this, right? And international law also does not tolerate it. So then it's a question of fact. If everyone agrees that there should not be any forced slavery or anything like this, then let some objective, independent observers visit China, give them free access. Let there be a fact finding. And that will be in the interest of the Chinese government. That will be in the interest of all companies that are operating in China and Xinjiang. And also that will be in the interest of the global community.
And Surya, on companies, you mentioned companies, and one of the things you've called for as well is that companies doing business there apply their own due diligence when it comes to human rights. So what are you talking about here? Potentially sanctions as well. Others have talked about even boycotting of the Olympics. That's a government issue. But let's look at companies and what you're expecting companies to do in this case.
Under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and they are precisely 10 years old now, and Chinese government also accept those guiding principles, all businesses must do human rights due diligence, which is an ongoing process to find out, to prevent and remediate human rights abuses. What we are hearing is that many companies are saying that they find it extremely difficult to do meaningful human rights due diligence in Xinjiang. That's why we are encouraging the Chinese government to let these companies do the due diligence, right? When it comes to sanctions, other matters, this is for not us. So we don't want companies to withdraw from a market simply because there are issues there, right? Because one company may withdraw, some other company may come in, and the systemic issues may remain there, right? So our approach is constructive engagement, both with the Chinese government as well as with businesses. But of course, if that is not happening, then of course they may have to make a call and withdraw from a market.
Surya Dave, it's been a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Stan.
啊，真的，这支颜色敷完之后就好贵。
And that's all we have time for on this week's show. Next week, animals as pets and 6G and the Great Firewall. And for more on China, you can download China If You're Listening on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Stan Grant. Have a good night.